Everyone, thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is on the topic of Community Solar Plus Resilience Hub in Duluth, Minnesota. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance. And before I pass it over to our exciting panel, I would like to go over a few very quick webinar logistics. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can tune in via telephone or via your computer, mic, and speakers. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console so that you can view the presentation full screen, you can click on the orange arrow that you see circled. You can also click on that orange arrow to expand your webinar console. One thing that you might like to do with your webinar console is to type in your questions and your comments. We will save about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for a Q&A with the audience, and we love to answer questions. So please type those in as you think of them. Final note, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send you an email within a day or two, and we will post the slides and recording on CISA's website, cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I am happy to pass it over now to our moderator for today's webinar, my colleague, Gabe Epstein. He's a project associate here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he will be kicking this off.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone for joining us today. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CISA, we are a nonprofit member organization of state energy agencies who are working to advance clean energy. So to do this, we have over 30 core and affiliate members across the country, many of whom you can see listed in the slide below. Today's webinar was produced under CISA's Solar with Justice project. Solar with Justice is looking at how state energy agencies and community-based organizations can collaborate more effectively to advance the benefits of solar for low-income and marginalized communities. Solar with Justice is primarily funded through the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office. Nathan Cummings Foundation has also provided funding support as well. If you follow the link at the bottom of the screen, you can learn more about the Solar with Justice project, access our other reports, case studies, and past webinars. Today's webinar is going to highlight the nonprofit organization Equilibrium 3 and their equity-focused climate resilience initiatives. Specifically, we'll be hearing from Executive Director Jody Slick about Equilibrium 3's recent construction of the Lincoln Park Solar Garden and the Resilience Hub, which is currently under development. These projects were recently explored in a case study published by CISA on July 6th. A link will be provided in the chat for those of you who have not yet gotten to read the case study. And I should also mention that the Resilience Hub that we'll be talking about received a Technical Assistance Fund grant, or TAF, from our sister nonprofit, the Clean Energy Group. We'll also put a link to learn more about that in the chat as well, and that was to conduct a solar and storage feasibility assessment. So as another reminder, we'll be sending out a recording of today's webinar, and please put your questions in the chat as we go. And with that, I will turn it over to Jody Slick to tell us more about her amazing work. Go ahead, Jody.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to share my screen and we'll kick it off. Let me just double check that we're good to go. Awesome. My name is Jody Slick. I'm founder and CEO of Equilibrium 3. Equilibrium 3 is a Duluth, Minnesota-based nonprofit organization that really operates out of a frontline environmental justice community. But the work that we do happens at multiple scales, depending on what is kind of appropriate for a particular program or project that we're working on. And I'm going to give you a little bit of our origin story to start out. Started out actually as an organization called Common Ground Construction. It was an organization that I was hired to start back in 2004 when a public housing project was coming down. And basically the theory of change there was that instead of employing machineries, what we could do is we could do a demonstration deconstruction project on the public housing. So we could employ people and we could recover materials that could then be either sold to raise some funds for affordable housing, or we could adaptively use those materials in affordable housing construction. We did that deconstruction work, did kind of the first pilot project, and then in the end, the overall deconstruction of this whole public housing project went to a crunch and dump company, and most of those materials were thrown away. But we continued to do some private deconstruction until some tax laws changed. And at that point, what we did is we shifted into green affordable housing construction for our parent nonprofit, which was a community land trust. And so a lot of our origin and the way in which we approach things is from some of the history of working with the land trust. Back in 2006, we were able to secure some grant funds from HUD to actually demonstrate solar technologies on some affordable homes. We were able to get $25,000 grants for 10 homes. And at the time, this is in the Wayback Machine, we would never have recommended solar PV. It was all about solar hot water because of the climate zone we were in, because where technology was, et cetera. And it actually, it was good to be able to do a demonstration project, but it also made us struggle with the idea that if we really wanted to affect energy, what we needed to be doing is spending $2,500 per home air sealing, not $25,000 per home working on some solar hot water. And so we actually started a community scale weatherization program that was supported by some ARA funds in 2008. And then in 2011, our parent nonprofit was merging with somebody else. So we kind of took all of our environmental justice, our weatherization, our energy work, and kind of separated common ground into two companies. And that's when and where Equilibrium 3 was born. One of the big things that has always guided our approach to things is using the idea of design thinking. Even when we were doing that stimulus work back in 2008, 2009, 2010, one of the big things that guided our work was this idea that at the time, about 2% of people that got an energy audit, and back at that time, a lot of people weren't getting energy audits, but only about 2% were actually following through on recommendations from that energy audit and doing improvements. And so we designed a process that at the time we called the Duluth Energy Efficiency Program to really try to puzzle out what were the barriers to actually getting the work done. And we found it was, we don't know what to do. We don't know how to pay for it. We don't know who can do the work. And we're still at a point in which people didn't necessarily trust that the work would be done right or would be done well. And so from the process that we put together, we actually got that conversion rate from 2% up to 65%. But it was kind of a high touch process, as well as because of stimulus funds, there were some incentives that we were able to bring to the table. Our next kind of big shift, and I'm kind of going through some of this history because what you'll see is when we think about the solar garden we built, when we think about the resilience hub and some other, I think, really innovative projects that we have moving forward, it's all kind of the same thought process, how we work with bringing stakeholders to the table and kind of think through what is going to be most effective, because we think knowledge is key, but action is what is really needed. So the next thing that we ended up doing is in 2012, we were working at that point, just getting to the end of our stimulus funds. And we had some EPA Climate Showcase dollars. And we had about 6 weeks to finish up our stimulus work, and our community ended up being hit with a 500-year rain event. And so as an organization, we actually panicked because all of a sudden there was this realization that we had 100+ weatherization jobs that needed to finish up to meet our metrics under stimulus. But some of those families finishing their weatherization was going to be the last thing on their mind. And at the same time, we had all of these households that now may need things like mechanical replacements, et cetera, that they weren't thinking about. And contractors now might not be available because of the flood, et cetera. And after about half an hour of working with our staff and thinking through how, in response to this disaster, we could still succeed in our stimulus work, which was supported by funds that had been given to the state of Minnesota. What we realized is that to rebuild our community, we needed to go through the exact same process that we had put in place for our energy efficiency work, which was this kind of third-party project management model. We would go in and we would assess the home under energy efficiency. We would then create a scope of work. We would create kind of the navigation of all of the different funding streams that could go into that project. Nowadays, we call it the resource braiding. Then what we would do is we would either help that household put the bids out to contractors that had been pre-vetted, or we would actually help them to train so that they could do the work themselves. And then we sat there as a trusted third party to be able to do, work on troubleshooting any issues that happened with that improvement. And it ended up, although we had 1,000+ homes that were impacted by our flood, our community, our region actually did not receive FEMA individual aid. And that meant that we didn't have FEMA grants available to help rebuild, but even more importantly, we didn't have the FEMA infrastructure on the ground to help pull people kind of through that disaster recovery process. And so after about a half an hour of panic about how we do our work, what we ended up doing to try to finish up our stimulus work, we ended up kind of flipping the switch on that and saying, you know what? Now is the moment in time in which we could retool our energy efficiency program and apply the capacity that we had built through stimulus and through the energy efficiency program into regional flood recovery. And for that work, we stood up kind of a new loan model, a resilient recovery model, disaster case management, et cetera. And we received some White House honors for that, for building a resilient community. From there, just in those few years, and most of you have been around for this type of shift, we actually moved from where you would never suggest PV to recognizing that with the costs of PV going down and the economic viability of it going up, that we needed to start shifting a northern cold climate community where everybody feels the wind and thinks that's absolutely what our renewable resource is, into beginning to advance solar. And so as a community-based organization, we ended up applying for DOE funds under their Solar Market Pathways project. And through that project really had teed up this idea that we are a nascent market, and what we need to do is we need to help move that technology adoption forward. We needed to kind of move the community into this space in which they see solar as a viable option. Up north here, we needed to deal with high soft costs, as well as kind of work on building not necessarily a workforce, but companies initially that would be willing to come into our area. And one of the things that we had done in partnership then with National Renewable Energy Lab, was providing some tech support at the time to the Solar Market Pathways project, is we actually had some students at our university digitize 60,000 building footprints so that we could create our own solar map. And now, of course, there are many of these tools that are out there, but at the time, I think we were maybe the second or third community in the nation to be able to kind of really look at what was possible and help size systems and help a solar contractor not have to, go out to a property to at least engage in that first conversation. Part of that project was actually the first time we ended up meeting the Clean Energy Group, and we're kind of huge fans of the Clean Energy Group. And part of that is looking at completing kind of our first solar plus storage project. And this is 2016. We had one of our very early adopter solar organizations at a nature center had put solar not only on the roof, but some pole mount solar. And it was at a point in which a lot of it wasn't functioning because there needed to be some retrofits of the inverters. And this was a time in which we wanted to increase the skills in our area, as again, we're a very nascent market, in looking at how is there going to be that operations and maintenance, and teaching how to, replace inverters. So we brought the utility together, Minnesota Power. We worked with trainers, Clean Energy Group. They were able to help us not only put on a course for the retrofit, but to do a demonstration solar plus storage project. And you may have heard that there's been this whole climate machine that's been built that's kind of spitting Duluth out as kind of like the climate refuge city. And you just heard about our floods, but what ended up happening with this project is we had a huge windstorm that actually where this project was, they ended up without power for a week. Literally, we had one of our staff members going up there to help unload the battery, and he had grabbed his headlamp because there wasn't power at the site, and the power was actually restored about a half an hour before the battery was delivered. So kind of from a timing point of view, we missed it by that much, but it was kind of our first jump into this idea of solar plus storage, resilient power, and then really learning from the Clean Energy Group and their resilient power project. And that's kind of what led us into when we started thinking about a resilience hub here in Lincoln Park, outreaching to that group really for the technical assistance. What launched our solar garden, really the very beginning of that was the fact that our utility created a low-income solar program. And as part of that, they were going to be doing grants that could help create a system. And now this is not our project. This is a project with the American Indian Community Housing Organization, and is something that kind of demonstrates multiple roles that we play in our community. When that low-income solar program and grants launched with our utility, as somebody that had been involved in trying to build the market here, what we did is we went to nonprofit organizations that we could see that were property owners that could benefit from that type of program. And so the first thing we did is actually reach out to other nonprofits to say, hey, this is here. We can help provide the technical support so that perhaps your project could move forward and get the funding. And this is just one of my favorite pictures. Yes, it has the solar and that makes it awesome, but I love the water protector mural that we have here in downtown Duluth. This is, however, our project, because when we were doing that due diligence, there were two things that kind of intersected, and that became part of what is called the Lincoln Park Solar Garden, which is a 38 kilowatt array. And that is that one of the nonprofits that wanted to do solar was the Minnesota Assistant Council for Veterans at their Duluth Veterans Place. And so that's two buildings that were rehabbed that serve as the MACV offices, serves as temporary housing for homeless vets, as well as permanent affordable housing for veterans. And they wanted to do solar, and they had actually applied for funding to Minnesota Power's low-income solar, but it ended up upon review, the roofs that they would have put the solar on were not going to be sufficient to be able to host the solar. That felt to me like a personal responsibility. And it is because one of the last projects Common Ground Construction did before we divided the companies and I moved over to Equilibrium 3 was to do that rehab. And so it kind of felt like, you know, redoing the roof wasn't, you know, or structurally looking at that wasn't part of that project, but it kind of felt like, ouch, you know, here is a dynamic group that's doing amazing work. And right now they're disadvantaged to be able to move into this equitable solar space. And so, so that was one part of the story. The other part of the story is we are in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about the neighborhood soon. But there is, Lincoln Park is the neighborhood right before you get to downtown. It has the Duluth port. It's this, you know, amazing neighborhood, but also highly, highly challenged. And in the entrance into our neighborhood that is towards our downtown, the city owned this strip of land that we saw as a perfect place to do solar. And as an organization, we're often not looking for like one problem that we're trying to solve in multiple ways. We're often looking for one solution that can help us solve multiple problems. And so years earlier, again, really before there was even a solar grants program or anything along those lines, we had identified this strip of land as being key to, because it's right on the interstate, it could help brand our community as somebody that was moving, or a community that was moving towards a cleaner, greener future. But it also could start to serve as a foundation, as a new entrance into our low-income environmental justice neighborhood. And I joke, and this is actually a true story, is that once we decided that there could be an opportunity potentially to put solar there, it's land that is owned by the city of Duluth. I actually printed out a map that had these lots on there, and I put a big mark around it, and I wrote dibbies. And my joke is that when I was at City Hall working with other departments in our community work, or various departments, I had that with me, and I like pulled it out to the director of planning, and I said, oh, by the way, I just wanted to show you these lots here, the city owns them, dibbies, we're claiming them for solar. And then I'd always make the joke that, and it's my understanding that the process is once you claim dibbies to 5 different city departments, it's yours. Like that's the transfer. And we had not really the funding or kind of the reality of solar, like even really on the horizon at that point, but we did see it as a really good match to meet a lot of our needs. And so I thought it was funny because about 2 years later, again, we don't yet have a project. The city had gotten a tree grant because adjacent to this lot, there is a cross-city trail, so a bike trail. And they had gotten a tree grant to plant some trees along that trail. And I didn't know that my claiming dibbies had worked yet until one day I get a call from the Parks Department that they were going to be locating trees along the trail. And they were told that this was going to be our lot for solar. So we better, they needed to meet with me on site to make sure that their trees weren't going to interfere with our solar. So, you know, that might be one of those, put it out to the universe, and in the end, you know, you're establishing a vision, and eventually you can get there. And actually we have. So we did a lot of community engagement around this. And one of my favorite sessions that we did was actually bringing community members together, and artists and engineers and university students and businesses. And we did a design session. We had put everybody onto different teams, and they all made these incredible connections about what could be a solar installation that also at the very basic could be, you know, this new entrance to the neighborhood. So some focused on the garden, some focused on, you know, solar statues and all of that. But in the end, it was just a great opportunity for people to start feeling some energy about what was potentially possible. One of the big things that we did for this project that made the project more expensive, but again, because we had multiple benefits we were looking at, is that the other solar, community solar that the utility had put in prior to this, you know, was a low mount solar, fences around, etc. And so for us, again, to be able to take into account, people seeing it from the highway, for us to get to a point in which eventually this would be community placemaking, in which people could be interacting on that site, and it can serve some future multiple purposes, etc. We very much chose to invest in high mount solar. We also chose to invest in mounts that would allow us to tip it. And we had one project where we had a team of engineering seniors at the University of Minnesota Duluth kind of go through and do a big analysis regarding, tilting it, tracking, what system they could potentially design, all of that. And we do have enhanced production because of the tilting, probably not really enough to cover the costs of doing the tilting. But as a community-based organization that was trying to advance the whole idea of solar, one thing that we thought that the tilting would do, and maybe my staff isn't real happy about this now because it's not always the easiest thing in the world to do, but we thought that if nothing else, with being able to tilt it twice a year to take into account the seasons, gives us a reason to be inviting people into solar and talking about solar and celebrating and all of that. So it kind of serves as a little bit of an ongoing calendar to engage the community and others in conversation. One thing that was really key about this particular project, and in the end we were able to raise all of the funds for the particular for the project, was the type of partnerships that we had put together. It really was launched because Minnesota Power started their low-income solar grant program. And when you're a nonprofit, there always has to be somebody that's that first in, that gives you the confidence that you can really start trying to visualize something. And in the end, we at Equilibrium 3 talk about wanting to be in this space. There's a lot of where people are kind of trying to set up where there's conflict, and actually there are places in which there are real conflicts, and that could be between energy companies and an environmental group, or it could be a business versus this, etc. And what we try to do at Equilibrium 3 is recognize that even where you may have partners that are in conflict with one another, or have different theories of how our community should be, etc. Even in those situations, you're generally able to find some sort of common ground. And maybe that's because we started as common ground, I don't know. But for this particular project, we were able to bring the faith community together, our businesses, individuals. We were able to bring utilities together, environmental groups, etc., foundations, etc. And we also were awarded a U.S. Council of Mayors Innovation Prize for that, and that created some national attention on this. And so we became part of the Left Coast Fund, which was working on a solar moonshot program, in which what they were trying to do is invest in one project in every state in the nation. And so we became the Minnesota Project. The other thing that we had looked at, and I think when we think about the IRA and we think about opportunities and how do we get to low-income households right now, there is this challenge. If you're going to build a project, who does that project benefit? Do you create that long-term sustainability for a low-income family because they're going to get 25 years of benefit of solar? Do you instead invest those funds in which maybe somebody receives that benefit for 5 years, but then somebody else has the opportunity? In our case, we recognized that there was kind of 38 kilowatts isn't going to necessarily produce a lot of value. We were very fortunate to work with Minnesota Power because there's no load on this site, but we were still able to get kind of a net metering. And so what ends up happening is that goes into an account, and then we apply for our credit. We get paid by Minnesota Power, and then about a quarter of the value of that goes to the Minnesota Assistant Council of Veterans, and the remaining value goes into an emergency energy fund, or an energy fund, energy equity fund. And so right now, the way in which we've been using those funds are as a gap filler for when other resources are unable to be applied to help those that are experiencing poverty. So for example, our most recent project is there's a Black-led nonprofit in our community that does tremendous work working with young moms aged 12 to 24. And so they're renting a house that has all of these huge energy needs. Some of the way in which we do our weatherization is through like community development grant, block grant funds. And it was just a very difficult situation because they didn't own the property, and then you have all of these moms and their babies, and how you do income qualifications to meet HUD standards and all of that. And because we had the emergency energy fund, or the energy equity fund, we were able to just say, yes, what we can do is we will come in and we will help this particular development. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. When we first conceived of this was pre-pandemic, and so who knew that, you know, within even before we turned the switch on, we were going to be in a situation in which all of a sudden we had all of these people in arrears because of the pandemic. One of our secret sauces for how we've been able to do work in our community is the fact that we run an AmeriCorps Vista program. And so this is one of our Vistas, Lucas Giese. He actually ended up helping to put together and do some of the fundraising, as well as help on some of the project management side to get this project moving forward. And we had put this together when he was leaving, just kind of as a thank you, because what ended up happening is right when we were going to be starting the project, pandemic hit. In the end, we were able to get it constructed in the fall of 2020. But we were very, very enveloped in a lot of the pandemic response work because of that previous leadership we took in flood recovery. We learned an absolute lot that in the end was very applicable to helping businesses in our community respond to the pandemic. And so between when we were going to break ground on the project and when we actually did, an example that we were able to do because of the AmeriCorps Vista program is we actually stood up a micro factory where we had over 1,000 volunteers assemble 225,000 face shields at that critical time in the pandemic in which PPE was not available. And so, you know, I want people to know that there are lots of potential resources out there, but it's the people resources that often make it happen, and AmeriCorps has been very key to that. And I do think with the IRA and the opportunities that are ahead of us now, we need to be continuing to support that program, because Vistas are capacity builders, but some of their other programs are direct service. And if we're going to get a door-to-door transition happening, that's a really good route to potentially pursue that. And our Vistas, just really quick, are also some of the engine that have been behind us putting together a Citizens Climate Action Plan with a number of nonprofits. And when we think about partnerships, sometimes our partnerships are on the on-the-ground partners that are helping to fund something, or we're working on policy together, or we're standing up a program, or we're doing planning, etc. But sometimes we also have where we consider as something a partnership because another organization, you know, has taken the time to build the knowledge that we need in order to do things. And when we think about our energy efficiency program, solar, etc., there are a number of those organizations. Our state energy office, for example, has been amazing on allowing us to kind of build on their resources. We'll talk on the resilience hub. The USDN, for example, has also been amazing. And when we talk about intersections, you know, even our vistas, one of the challenges we have for housing for them, and that's intersectional with our energy work, as we're actually working right now on rehabbing a home. And even though we've been doing energy work for a long time, it's been interesting that we are still struggled with how do you make a brick home energy efficient so that our AmeriCorps can live affordably. All of this work, when we think about the disaster recovery, that was for 7 communities, or 7 counties in northern Minnesota and northwestern Wisconsin. When we think about our Duluth energy efficiency work, that of course has been within the city of Duluth. When we think about, we do audit services for Minnesota Power, that goes throughout their territory, which is in a larger portion of central and northern Minnesota. But our deepest amount of work is where we live, is kind of the heart of our work, and that is the Lincoln Park neighborhood. And that is about 6,000 folks. And if we get even smaller, where the solar garden is, where the resilience hub is, et cetera, that is when we get into even 1 census tract. And so we will often tell the story of Lincoln Park 156. That's the census tract where our office is. And it is the census tract where the residents are in the lowest 0.5% of life expectancy for all Minnesotans. We've got very high poverty. We have high levels of disability. It is not only a food desert, but kind of like the highest priority food access area. And the greater than 10 years less life expectancy, that's from 2000 actually. There's been some additional data analysis that's been that's, you know, more than 12 years, and if you are a person of color, it exceeds 20 years. So this is where we're again often trying to figure out what the nudges are, the programs are, the policies are, to move the health of our neighborhood forward. And of course, climate and energy work is a huge part of that. Our built environment, and I'm going to talk about 156, is it doesn't, you know, when you have high poverty and 100-year-old homes, we've got a huge number report lack of affordable housing. We've got about 70% of those living in the census tract are in rentals. We've got high lead service lines. We have barriers to getting food. We have individuals who, because they're not necessarily able to eat actually like nutritiously dense food, we have high health issues regarding being overweight, etc. And right now we have no grocery store. We also know that it's our residents, when you look at the regional health indicators, etc., that it's our residents that often are the ones that feel the most isolated. And research is now coming out on the health side that feeling isolated or feeling lonely is actually worse than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or being obese. And so figuring out, and all of this plays into the idea of a resilience hub, figuring out again how you can use an asset in your community to be dealing with day-to-day health, as well as some of these energy and environment climate issues is really where we're trying to move. A resilience hub, and again, there's I absolutely recommend, there's a great report out there from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. They've done on Resilience Hub. It's a great read about how you can engage with your community, on how to set them up, etc. But I love really the definition, because I think it's core to what we believe also, is that a resilience hub becomes a space in which you can be engaging with your residents and building that social connection, building power, educating, etc., on a day-to-day basis. It becomes a trusted space for a community that, by the way, can perform essential double duty at time of grid outage or during any other kind of form of disaster. And that's what we're working on here. When the pandemic closed a fairly unused senior center, The Duluth HRA approached us, as well as some other nonprofits, about the idea of what this building could become. And for us doing the really deep work in Lincoln Park, what we saw is this is an opportunity to kind of hold a container in which we could operate the facility, but really help a number of nonprofit organizations and fill in a bunch of gaps that were missing in our neighborhood. And so what you're seeing here is you're seeing two buildings. One is the two-story kind of former, I think, Catholic school. And next to that was a dining hub that was put in place when the two public housing towers behind them had been senior housing. And those are no longer senior housing. There isn't the senior dining happening, et cetera. So what we were looking at doing is, again, how do we start to rethink these facilities so that we can kind of densify the use and the connectiveness, as well as determine whether or not there really is that energy resilience we could bring. Because if you're going to have some spot in a community, it absolutely should be in our neighborhood, and it should be attached to some of the individuals' housing that is most generally at risk. This site, using some ARP dollars, had already in the basement determined that they would do a remodel there so that could become a winter warming shelter. So February of this past year, CHUM, which is another nonprofit in our community, started running an overnight warming center here that at some time saw up to 90 individuals. So that's something that will generally in the future be open October 15th through April 15th, and then gives us an opportunity to have like youth programming in the summer, so that we can again use the space as much as possible. We're looking at expanded food opportunities, solving the digital design divide that we have with the computer lab, because our residents we don't have like a library or anything along those lines in this neighborhood. We also don't have any healthcare assets, so we're looking at setting up telehealth, et cetera, as well as being a place in which there can be some self-organization of our community, because that's one way in which you can really start kind of de-isolating individuals, as well as helping to establish an individual sense of purpose. And then when there is a disaster, how can this place make sure that it's ready to kind of stand up for those disaster resources that are needed? Lots of different partners that have been part of the process so far, and that some of the logos that you're seeing here, very key was the Duluth HRA, helping, subscribing to this vision and helping us kind of lease the property to us, as well as we've done a lot of the health work with St. Louis County Health. And then you've got those that are running the warming center, some of our BIPOC organizations and our aging organizations, because those are the populations we're really focused on. And we are just getting to a point in which there will be some remodeling that are going to be happening here. And one thing that's made for our neighborhood is that we have been working with an architect that has experience in trauma-informed design, as well as really looking at inclusive design and healthy spaces, et cetera, in addition, of course, to the climate and energy work. Funding for this project so far has been because of the warming center operations. We're trying to kind of pivot the entrance to the community center to be a secondary entrance that we have here. So we've needed to put in accessibility there. So we've gotten some block grant funds to be able to add a half-story lift. The biggest chunk is coming from a capital improvements program that the state put out there through the Department of Employee and Economic Development. And that not only is going to help us with the remodel of the community center here, but it's taking our old office space, which is on our main street, and allowing us to turn that into a small footprint grocery store. And then the really important energy analysis, et cetera, was facilitated by the Clean Energy Group and CERTS, which is Clean Energy Resource Teams here in Minnesota. And this is what we found out. We found out that if we were to be looking at solar and storage as our resilience option, what would be possible and not possible. And really, when we think about kind of winter use here, solar and storage would not really be able to kind of touch the needs we would need to be able to be operating. Because we're part of the housing project, there is a generator, boilers, etc. And so we ended up pivoting more of the conversation into this idea of what if it was more of, along the lines of a cooling center. As we looked at that, unfortunately, what we found is that even if, like with our solar garden, we could get the entire thing paid for, we were going to be in a situation in which there would be kind of a resilience premium to being able to do the solar plus storage. And, you know, I think it ended up being about $20,000 over, you know, where we would need to be over the term, kind of, that would be kind of like our annual resilience premium. And so that brings us again to this idea of design thinking. And so as much as adding the solar and storage would be amazing, we need to ask ourselves, if we were going to invest $20,000 a year in resilience, is this how we would do it? Especially with some of those other resources that are available. So right now, we're not moving forward with the solar plus storage project here, but we did learn a number of things through there. One of which was just in these older buildings that have been cobbled together in different ways over the years, how we need to get to a point in which we're able to use e-gauge, et cetera, to kind of start really teasing apart the different circuits. If we're going to be thinking about what is the critical power needs that we would have to be able to shrink whatever system we would, you know, maybe eventually choose on the solar or on the battery side. And we know, again, because we're in a very old neighborhood, that even as we start looking at like our small businesses, and we look at our nonprofits, or we look at individual households, that same type of disaggregation of some really weird wiring needs to happen. We would love to see, because now, unlike when we started our solar work under Solar Market Pathways, where everybody was telling us you can't do solar, we recently did a survey of our Main Street businesses, because we run the Lincoln Park Main Street group. And when asked what type of sustainability options they would like to pursue, 100% said solar. So, and that is just, you know, again, in this 6 or 7 year time frame. And so we are looking then at some of that disaggregation, as well as moving towards a solar group buy under some of the IRA. Two other things that we're working on is we have worked with the city of Duluth and received a Renewables Accelerating Community Energy Resilience Grant. And so the city is going to be looking at kind of all of their assets, and also looking at things like resilience hubs and where that makes sense. And Equilibrium 3 is doing kind of the ground level research with residents to better understand, you know, when there's a grid outage, what are the negative consequences? And what we know is that honestly, it's different if it's 100 degrees versus if it's 20 below, or if it's during a severe rain event. And so what are those negative consequences? Who is most impacted by each of those scenarios, or the negative consequences? And then what are either distributed micro resilience resources, like a siphon-based backup sump pump, shared resources like a cooling center, or grid level resources like larger solar plus storage, etc. That is the best solution to really meet the needs of the individual or the business. And so it's a grant called Form Follows Function, because, you know, none of the solutions in the space we're talking about is a one size fits all. And so let's try to inform what the best investments are at the right scale with the right partners. And then the other one that I am absolutely ecstatic about is, as an organization, The solar garden is now the beginning of a 1.6 mile Main Street, West Superior Street in Duluth. That's where our businesses are, et cetera, that received a USDOT RAISE grant. So we're going to be able to totally rebuild that street as a climate forward street that's actually going to be testing out some lower carbon concrete. It's going to have EVs. It's an active transportation corridor. So all of that is baked in to really meet the future of our community from both a climate and a human position, et cetera. And so because we were able to secure that RAISE grant, when the DOE put out a geothermal coalition, FOA, we were in a situation in which we knew we were already going to be digging down to the utility layer. And one thing about being an environmental justice community is it's our neighborhood that has the regional wastewater treatment plant that takes in from 500 square miles, processes things, et cetera. And so we are just starting the analysis and design under a geothermal grant from the DOE that can look at this like intersection of opportunity and actually explore the potential for 3 of our streets to put in a new district energy system. And it would be actually using heat pump technology that would be capturing the waste heat from our wastewater treatment plant. And not only, this is where I start sounding like an infomercial, but wait, there's more. We could do 2.4 million square feet of our buildings here in Lincoln Park. We've added as part of that analysis the resilience hub and the public housing. But we also, there's enough heat there that could be captured that we could actually hook into our downtown district energy system and take on 1.8 million square feet of the hot water loop that exists there, and still potentially have some excess energy. And so this concept of the Energy Equity Fund that we started with a 38 kilowatt solar array is now something that if we're able to tap into this new energy source, we're really advocating for this opportunity to potentially, maybe set aside 10% of the new value of this renewable energy under this geothermal project to deepen equity commitments. So we'll have to turn in the analysis and design next year, and then hopefully it will be down selected for some implementation dollars, because there are 3 of these systems in Sweden, 3 in Finland, 1 in China, none in the US. And if you think about the very definition of environmental justice, neighborhoods, they're the ones that are hosting the wastewater treatment plants. And there's 16,000 or actually more than that, public wastewater treatment plants in the US. And so just now start imagining what has been the burden to an EJ neighborhood becomes our new energy source and can build our resilience. And I now will pop on and stop sharing my screen and have a little time for questions.
Thank you, Jody. Wow, that is really, really exciting. I didn't know about that geothermal project. So it is 12:53. We've got 6 or 7 minutes for some questions here. The first one is we have someone who's interested to know a little bit about how the funding and the renewable energy credits from the solar garden are collected and then distributed to all of their various recipients.
Sure. So as part of Minnesota Power's low-income solar project, they maintained the renewable energy credits. And so for this particular project, the way that we worked it out with Minnesota Power is they basically net meter our solar. And so we have an account with Minnesota Power like anybody else would have an account, except ours is building a credit. And then what we can do is we apply to receive a check to kind of zero out that credit. And then we send the funds to MACV, and then we hold on our balance sheet the value that remains 10% of which we're setting aside for operations and maintenance, and the rest then is applied to projects like the one I talked about regarding Divine Connections.
Thank you, Jody. And similarly on the solar project, you talked some about the design sessions with community, but can you elaborate on some of the other ways that you've engaged with community and stakeholders for input?
Sure. So this is one of those situations in which this is our neighborhood. And so it's a little bit different than a lot of situations where you may have a solar developer or a broader nonprofit that wants to, place a project in a particular community. This has been our heart and our home, and we're engaging with our neighborhood in tons of different ways. And it's everything from being at the farmers market on a weekly basis to helping to run the open streets events to monthly meetings where we've got 40 to 50 of our businesses for our main street. And then we did also work with the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources under a STAR grant to actually do 4 kind of workshops in which, as we talked about this site, we wanted not just to kind of like randomly grab, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? But actually to bring the various voices together and co-learn some stuff. And so we did things, for example, talking about the history in the area, bringing in our Indigenous leaders. We worked and looked at kind of the water and the watershed as to what this could grow up into above and beyond the solar. And then projects, for example, with the university engineers, and then design sessions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jody. We have a question from somebody from a state energy agency who's interested to hear more about how the State Energy Office in Minnesota has been supportive to your work.
Sure. So they've been supportive to our work in a number of different ways. One is that they did have some solar funds, and so the State Energy Office brought funding to this particular project, which was great. And that actually, because we're not a Twin Cities environmental organization, was actually one of the first deeper connections that we had with some of the staff members that we hadn't previously known. They're federal grants people, et cetera. We also work with them under, they put together something called a Community Energy Collaborative, and that was really about bringing frontline organizations together. And I think that you did a good job describing it in the report. It really is about having a state energy office that is less reactive to things and actually more proactive by making sure that frontline organizations are engaged across program design as well as looking at policies, et cetera. And those connections, hopefully are going to be turning into some additional ways in which the State Energy Office is helping pull the resources together to work with a number of EJ frontline organizations to help kind of build out an energy navigator system to make sure that the current moment in time is not missed by these communities.
Thanks, Jody. I think we have time for one more, so we'll do one that can kind of cap it off nicely. What advice would you give to any other community organizations and state energy offices that are interested in doing similar work as Equilibrium 3?
Yeah, I think that there's a real challenge, and I'm going to talk from the State Energy Office point of view, that oftentimes when we're engaging with community, it's because we have a need. There's one question we want to know about how we should put this program out on the table, et cetera. I think the best type of space, and this is, I don't know that there's too many really good examples of that, but it's where we need to be moving towards, is where there actually is a true dialogue and not one state silo asking a frontline organization just to give them input in the one thing the State Energy Office, for example, might need, but instead is truly creating a longer term relationship and is really open to this idea that if a community is saying this is what our needs are, then if it's not part of that state agency's work, how do we make sure that we're following through and making those connections? And the one example that I would give that I think has been an amazing dialogue with the state is the frontline organizations have talked about with the IRA, but not just with the IRA, but with other things that our residents need, like SNAP benefits, etc. How do we create the easy button? Use that design thinking, think about the user, and make their interaction with our government and the resources they need as easy as possible. Some of that has to do with our state energy office, but the fact that they are willing to take that conversation and use some of their political and social capital and start trying to figure that out across our state agencies, to me is amazing, and is one reason why I think Minnesota is amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Jody. This was a really great presentation. We're just past our time, so I will turn it back over to Sam. I believe we have one or two announcements and we are all set. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Gabe. Thank you, Jody. That was really great. And thanks everyone who attended. We have another webinar coming up that may be of interest. The topic is, can virtual power plants replace peaker plants? A conversation with Clean Energy Group and Brattle Group. So I won't answer that question for you. I'll let you find out on August 3rd. We hope to see you then. And thanks again to everyone who joined us for this. Bye-bye.